Hey, we are back, and we are here again to talk about the New Testament Recovery Version Study Bible. If you haven't watched the last few videos, we're getting into the notes, the study notes of this Bible. Why? We want to make sure that these notes are cutting straight the word of the truth. In 2 Timothy 2:15, Paul tells Timothy to be an unashamed workman or craftsman, someone like working with wood, who needs to make a straight line and cut straight. You can use the Bible and you can twist it. And we want to see, are these notes twisting the Bible in a not proper way? Or are they cutting straight? Are they based upon the Bible? Are they accurate? And that's what we've been trying to verify in the last few videos. And so if you haven't caught the last few, check them out, give them a listen. Today, before we moved on from Matthew chapter 1, we wanted to look at one note which compares the four Gospels. If you've never read the New Testament, it's really interesting. It starts with four Gospels, four books that are all about when Jesus Christ was on the earth during his 3.5-year ministry before he died and resurrected and ascended. Okay? And it's really interesting when you get into these four Gospels because some things are mentioned in others and they're left out in another gospel, okay? They're not all the same. Sometimes a story is mentioned 3 times in 3 gospels, but then it's not in another gospel. And when you dive into all these little intricacies and details, what it shows is it shows another aspect of Christ or emphasizes and highlights another aspect of Christ. And it's quite fascinating. All right. At the end of this video, I'm going to share a little story how I was blown away when I was one time distributing Bibles with this guy, and he shared this story that shocked me and related it to the 4 Gospels, to some obscure portion in the Old Testament. So check that out. But first of all, we're going to dive into this note that starts to explain the differences in the 4 Gospels. And this is the note on Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the note on Jesus, all right? And it's the 3rd paragraph. It says this: Christ as the wonderful center of the entire Bible is all-inclusive, having many aspects. The New Testament at its beginning presents 4 biographies to portray the 4 main aspects of this all-inclusive Christ. The Gospel of Matthew testifies that he is the King, the Christ of God prophesied in the Old Testament, who brings the kingdom of the heavens to the earth. All right, so that's Matthew. The Gospel of Mark tells us that he is the servant of God, laboring for God faithfully. Mark's account is most simple, for a servant does not warrant a detailed record. The Gospel of Luke presents a full picture of him as the only proper and normal man who ever lived on this earth. As such a man, he is the Savior of mankind. Interesting, it says mankind and not just the Jews, everyone, right? The Gospel of John unveils him as the Son of God, the very God himself, who is life to God's people. Among the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke have a record of genealogy. Mark and John do not. To testify that Jesus is the King, the Christ of God prophesied in the Old Testament, Matthew needs to show us the antecedents and status of this King to prove that he is the proper successor to the throne of David. The note goes on, but we're going to pause there. Okay, so when you dive into these 4 Gospels, it's like they give a different aspect of Christ. So it's kind of like, okay, if for those who are watching the video, not just listening to the podcast, it's like if I turn like this, you only get to know me to the right side of my face. But hey, I got a front, and I got a left side, and I got a back. I ain't going to show you, all right? But so there's 4 sides to a person. And likewise, it's like there's 4 sides to Christ, and each biography highlights a side, okay? And the biography presented in Matthew is the one of a king. Jesus Christ is the King. What gives us some proof to say that? Well, in that note we read, and as we've seen the last few videos, this gospel begins right away with a genealogy that goes back to David and to Abraham, right? Okay, genealogies are big deals for certain people. You know who? Kings. Not just anybody in any old country can just sit on the throne. You got to have that lineage, right? And so Jesus Christ is a descendant of David. And David is a descendant of Judah. There's this really cool verse in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Jacob is towards the end of his life, and then he blesses his 12 sons, right? And when he gets to Judah, he says this in verse 10. He says, the scepter will not depart from Judah. This is amazing. Like, David isn't even on the scene yet. He's generations away. Jesus Christ is generations away. And Jacob prophesied. He predicted the future, and he said, the scepter will not depart from Judah. What does that mean, the scepter? Well, if you go to, let's see, I wrote it down here. Yeah, Psalm 45, verse 6, it says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. The scepter is something a king has for ruling, and it's for the kingdom. It's of the kingdom. So Jesus Christ is a descendant of Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah, and Jesus Christ's throne is forever and ever. And then there's this other verse, which is a big verse in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 and 13. It is he, this is Christ, who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Christ's throne is established forever. Okay? Jesus Christ is the king. He's got this genealogy. What else is there that's interesting? Okay, another thing that's mentioned is that I did a study. The word kingdom is used, I think, about 45 times in the Gospel of Matthew. And in Mark, it's much less. In Luke, it's a little less, maybe about low 40s. And then in John, the word kingdom is used like 3 times or something. It's not used hardly at all. So the emphasis in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus Christ is the king. He's coming to inherit the kingdom. He's our king. Is he my king? He needs to be. He needs to rule us. He needs to be the king in our hearts. We need to let him not just sit on the throne that's established forever and ever, but how about the throne in our hearts and rule in us, right? Okay, one last interesting thing about Matthew before we jump to Mark is that it's fascinating to me that Matthew is one of the 12 disciples. He's with Jesus. He goes up to the mountain where Jesus ascends. He sees Jesus ascend, but yet when he writes his gospel, he does not mention the ascension of Jesus Christ. It's omitted. The last verse of Matthew is Matthew 28:20. It says, behold, I am with you all the days until the consummation of the age, or the end of time. It depends on the translation. And it's really interesting. And there's a note that highlights it. If you go to Matthew 28 in this Bible, you should get it and check it out. It says the reason why Matthew omits his ascension is because Jesus is our King who is with us even today. When you mention the ascension, you record the ascension, of course he ascended, but it's almost like it implies, okay, yeah, he's distant. But that promise in Matthew 28:20 is that he's with us all the days until the consummation of the age. And here's where it gets more interesting. We've been in Matthew chapter 1. Towards the end of Matthew chapter 21, it fulfills that prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. The virgin shall bear a child, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, right? And then Jesus comes, and he's born of Mary, fulfills that prophecy, and they call his name Emmanuel. Almost all Christians know Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. He's with us. God is with us when Jesus is with us. Really interesting. The word Emmanuel is only mentioned in Matthew and only in chapter 1. It's not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. That's it, right? So Matthew chapter 1 begins with God with us in chapter 1. And then you go to the last chapter where you would think there'd be the ascension, but the ascension is not mentioned. But instead what is mentioned is, behold, I am with you all the days until the consummation of the age. And so it's like Matthew begins with God with us, and Matthew ends with God with us. Isn't that awesome? God is with us. Okay, so you go on to Mark. Matthew has 28 chapters. Mark has 16 chapters. And Mark is it's more simple. That note we read, it's more simple. And it highlights that Jesus Christ is the servant of God or slave of God. And that's an interesting statement, especially because that could be, because of the history of slavery and how terrible it is. It could be a loaded term that would spark a lot of reactions. But we need to go to the Old Testament and we need to see, is there a prophecy concerning a servant of God? And there's some verses that are referenced in a footnote at the beginning of Mark. I want to read these verses in Isaiah 42. It says this, "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights." Okay, so God the Father delights in this servant. Listen to this. "I have put my spirit upon him." We know that the Spirit was put upon Jesus after he was baptized, right? "And he will bring forth justice to the nations." Who's bringing forth justice to the nations except Jesus? "He will not cry out, nor lift up his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street." And then it goes on in verse 3 and verse 4 to say, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoking flax, making a lot of smokes, he will not quench." And Matthew actually mentions those verses, pointing them to Jesus. Okay, so Jesus is this servant or slave of God, and we see him as such in the book of Mark. What are some indicators? One is there's no genealogy. No genealogy. A servant does not need a genealogy, right? And here's another thing. Have you ever thought, if you're examining a servant, what's more important with a servant, what he says or what he does? If there's a servant, you expect obedience and the tasks to be accomplished and done. And that's the Gospel of Mark. Like, many of the profound things Jesus said are omitted, and they're not there in the Gospel of Mark. Everyone loves the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. We all love it. It's awesome. It's wonderful. It's nowhere in the Gospel of Mark. Many of the parables Jesus spoke, recorded in Matthew and in Luke, they're not in the Gospel of Mark. Where are they? Well, Jesus is the servant of God in the Gospel of Mark, and he is just doing what his Father wants him to do. He is just obedient, and he's on the go. Another reason we know this is there's a word used very often in the Gospel of Mark, and it's the word immediately. And immediately he went here, and immediately he went there. He was so quick to obey. Okay? So this is Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. He is the servant. Now it's interesting. The ascension is recorded in the Gospel of Mark in the last chapter, Mark 16. And I was wondering about this, considering the Bible, and why is it recorded in Mark 16, the ascension? And I was wondering, it could be, this is just me hypothesizing, it could be because it matches Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through about 9, I think. You remember where it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, Christ existed in the form of God, did not consider being equal with God a treasure to be grasped, but he emptied himself, becoming in the likeness of man, taking the form of a slave." That's the Gospel of Mark, right? "And then he became obedient even unto death, and that the death of a cross." Wow, what obedience by this servant of God. "Therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that in the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." I think it ends something like that. But the point is, you see him there as a slave, and ultimately he ends up in ascension, getting glory. And that's the Gospel of Mark. He comes down to serve man, and then he's ascended. And lastly, there's this key verse in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, where Jesus speaks and he says, "The Son of Man," that's himself, "the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Okay? So there we see Jesus as the servant of God. Now we move on to Luke. Luke's interesting. Luke shows that Jesus Christ is a genuine man bringing salvation for all mankind. Matthew was written to the Jewish believers. Luke, we know from Colossians chapter 4, he was a doctor, a physician, and also he was a Gentile. He was not Jewish. And so he kind of highlights that in his gospel. In chapter 2, for example, he mentions that Jesus is come as salvation for all mankind. It's not just the Jews, it's everyone, right? And then what gives us more basis to say it shows that he's a genuine man? There is a genealogy in Luke. It's in chapter 3. And unlike the genealogy in Matthew, which goes back to David and Abraham, this genealogy goes all the way back to Adam, showing that Jesus Christ is a descendant of the first man, yet without sin. Okay? So Jesus is a genuine man. And I was thinking, what are some other indicators? I don't know. It's just interesting to me that before he went to the cross, Luke is the one that mentions when he sweat in the garden the night before, his sweat became like drops of blood. For sure, Luke was a physician and could say that. But that also proves he was a genuine man under intense pressure and stress, right? And then finally, Luke 24 does mention the ascension, the last chapter. Okay? So we have two gospels with genealogies now, Matthew and Luke. Two without, Mark and John. We'll jump to John in a second. We also have two gospels that mention the ascension, Mark and Luke, but two gospels that do not mention the ascension, Matthew and John. Okay? So let's jump to John, all right? Who do we see Jesus is in John? It hits you right off the bat. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? Okay, well, who's the Word? And then you got to go forward to verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This version says tabernacled among us. Who became flesh? That's Jesus. So let's see. The Word is Jesus. And you go back to verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God. Okay. So in the beginning, in like eternity past, Jesus was there with God. But then it says the Word was God. So the Word is Jesus. The Word was God. Jesus is the Word. Jesus is God. Whoa. Okay. We need more proof. Let's look at more verses in the Gospel of John. Okay. In John chapter 8, verse 24, I believe it's 28, and then I know it's verse 58. Jesus is in this confrontation. The Pharisees are getting on him again, and he tells them, unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. A number of versions translate it, I am he. Okay? It can mean I am he, and it can also mean I am. And pretty much every translation translates verse 58 as I am. Okay? What does that mean, I am? In Exodus chapter 13, when God appeared to Moses in that burning bush, and Moses said, whom do I say sent me? Who do I tell Pharaoh sent me? God says, tell him, I am who I am has sent you. So God's people knew, I am, that refers to God. And now here, jump forward to John chapter 8. The Pharisees and Jesus are together, and Jesus tells them, before Abraham came into being, I am. Who is Jesus making himself? He's God. Jesus Christ is God. And then, when he said that, you know what happened. We know what happened. The end of John 8, they all picked up stones to throw at him. Why? Because here's a man saying that he's God. So they're thinking that's blasphemy because they don't realize it actually is God. And so they pick up stones to throw at him, and he goes out from their midst. Where'd he go? Okay, there's more proof that Jesus Christ is seen as God there in the Gospel of John. You go to John chapter 18 when he's getting arrested. It's really interesting. He says the same thing as in John chapter 8. Judas comes with all those people with torches and whatnot to arrest him. And Jesus tells them, who are you seeking? And they say, Jesus the Nazarene. And he says, I am. Or, you could translate it, I am he. I am. And then you read that account. Everybody falls on their face. No other account records it like that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, no. But there, it's like Jesus is God. And they're all, Eventually they get up and they arrest him and they take him away. But it's really interesting. Considering that this account is showing Jesus as God, that explains why there's no genealogy. Does God have a genealogy? No. Likewise, you consider, why is the ascension not mentioned in the Gospel of John? Well, God is omnipresent. Does God ascend? God is here. God's there. You see? So it's really interesting. And there's, obviously I'm doing I'm just blitzing through all of this, but you can get into more verses with details to see all the aspects, right? Okay. I promised you I would tell you a really cool story. So one time I was with this guy, and this is just an interesting parallel. It's just something to consider. Okay. I was with this guy and he was talking about this study Bible to somebody we met. And I was just with him, listening to him talk. And he started talking about these 4 aspects. And I was really surprised because he started talking about this thing in Ezekiel chapter 1 called the 4 living creatures. Okay? You read Ezekiel chapter 1, it is confusing. And there's this thing with 4 living creatures, and it's got 4 faces. And it's got a face of a man at the front, and then face of a lion on the side, face of an ox on the other side, and then in the back, face of an eagle. 4 faces. It's also mentioned in Revelation. Okay, chapter 4, I believe. Okay, listen to this. It's almost like, we talked about Luke 24 and how it mentions that the prophets speak of Christ. Well, it very well could be those 4 living creatures point to Jesus Christ, because there's only 4 gospels, and the 4 living creatures have 4 faces, and the first face is that of a man. Well, hey, that sounds like the Gospel of Luke, proving that Jesus is a man. And then the next face over here, I believe, is that of a lion. Well, hey, that sounds like the Lion of the tribe of Judah, of whom the scepter will not depart, the king. Whoa. And then there's the face of an ox. Well, an ox is for serving, for treading the grain. That sounds like the Gospel of Mark. And then back here, face of an eagle. Wow, that makes me think of that verse, mounting up on eagle's wings, God as an eagle. Oh, like John. John unveils that Jesus is God, soaring over all as an eagle. It's far out. It's crazy. But it very well could be pointing to Jesus Christ. I hope that we won't be tripped up by the Gospels, or even sometimes you can think they're boring because you're like, oh, I'm reading the same story again. We're not reading the same story again. When you go from Matthew to Mark to Luke to John, actually, once you dive into these different aspects, you discover Christ in a wonderful way. You appreciate him that much more. And hopefully we actually experience him as our king ruling us, like in Matthew, as the one who did not come to be served, but to serve us with salvation, like in Mark, as a genuine man who can sympathize with us, like in Luke, and as God who we worship, who we adore, who we love above all and everything else. Thanks for tuning in. Awesome. There's 4 Gospels. Next week, we're jumping to Matthew chapter 2 to dive into a note there to check it out. Hope you enjoyed it. See you then.